Tomorrow, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin meet in Alaska, face to face for the first time since Trump returned to the White House. The agenda says Ukraine, European security, maybe even a chance to reset relations. But on the eve of this high-stakes encounter, NATO's latest moves are setting off alarms, not just in Moscow, but across the entire security community. Officially, these are defensive drills and routine deployments, yet to Russian eyes they look uncomfortably like preparations for something bigger. The question is, will these actions give Washington leverage, or back Putin into a corner before the talks even start? Tonight we break down the moves, the motives, and why tomorrow's summit might already be walking a tightrope. The Alaska summit is no casual photo op. Anchorage, less than 600 miles from the Russian Far East across the Bering Strait, is one of the closest major American cities to Russian territory. According to CBS News, the talks will be held at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, a secure U.S. military installation used before for high-level state visits. As Reuters reports, the agenda will be dominated by the war in Ukraine. Moscow's leaked position is blunt: formal recognition of its control over Crimea and 4 Ukrainian regions annexed in 2022 in exchange for a ceasefire and a written promise not to advance further. For Washington, that's a high-stakes equation. Such a deal could cut U.S. military aid commitments, freeing resources for other hotspots like the Pacific. But it could also send a dangerous message that America will tolerate changing borders by force, undermining decades of post-World War II policy. European leaders, especially in Poland and the Baltics, are already pressing Trump to hold the line and reject any terms that weaken deterrence. And now, into this fragile diplomatic moment, NATO's latest actions are casting a shadow. Moves that could be seen as building leverage or as tightening the pressure just when diplomacy needs breathing room. Over the past 3 weeks, NATO's activity in Europe and the Arctic has shifted into high gear, moves that are impossible to ignore. The most visible example is the arrival of U.S. Air Force B-1B Lancer strategic bombers at RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom. These long-range, supersonic heavy bombers can carry both conventional and nuclear payloads. Officially, U.S. Air Forces in Europe says they are there for long-planned training missions under the Bomber Task Force program, which regularly rotates aircraft forward to train with allies. But Russian state media like TASS wasted no time framing the deployment as a clear signal that the West could deliver precision strikes deep inside Russian territory, a message aimed at stirring public vigilance. What makes this notable is capability. These bombers can be armed with Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, JSSMs, with a strike range of nearly 600 miles, meaning they could hit targets without ever leaving NATO-controlled airspace. At the same time, U.S. European Command confirmed that Tomahawk cruise missile launchers have been prepositioned in Germany, the first time since the 2019 collapse of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that land-based strike systems of this class have been on the continent. The INF Treaty once banned ground-launched missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, but its demise reopened the door to weapons that had been off-limits for more than 3 decades. Pentagon briefings covered by Defense News described these as part of a new land-based fires capability meant to give NATO rapid strike options in a crisis. NATO insists these are conventional weapons, but history shows that Moscow views any long-range missile deployment in Europe as a potential strategic threat that could justify countermeasures. In Eastern Europe, troop movements are also drawing attention. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have confirmed new battalions arriving from Canada, Germany, and the United States. The Polish Ministry of National Defense even released video of U.S. M1 Abrams tanks heading toward the Suwałki Gap, the narrow strip between Poland and Lithuania, considered NATO's most vulnerable choke point for a possible Russian advance from Belarus. OSINT analysts, including those at Janes, have used satellite imagery to show upgrades at air bases like Lask in Poland and Šiauliai in Lithuania, extended runways, reinforced shelters, and new radar installations. NATO calls these defensive resilience improvements, but in Moscow's eyes, they resemble preparations for sustained high-tempo air operations. Farther north, the Arctic has seen an unusual surge in Allied presence during the Arctic Forge and Cold Response exercises. According to the Norwegian Armed Forces, these drills include U.S. Navy Aegis destroyers operating near the Barents Sea, home to Russia's northern fleet bases on the Kola Peninsula. This is where Russia's strategic ballistic missile submarines are stationed, the backbone of its nuclear deterrent. NATO operations here have always been sensitive, but as melting ice opens Arctic shipping lanes and access to untapped resources, both sides have been expanding their military footprint. The Norwegian Joint Headquarters says the current cycle is one of the largest in over a decade, with live fire drills, anti-submarine warfare, and integrated air-sea maneuvers. On their own, each of these deployments can be explained as routine. Bomber task force missions are announced months in advance, Arctic drills happen annually, and troop rotations are part of NATO's standing commitments. But in geopolitics, timing changes everything. These moves are happening within days, sometimes hours, of Trump and Putin's scheduled meeting in Anchorage. In strategic signaling, that timing can turn an otherwise benign action into something far more provocative. And that is what makes them so sensitive right now. Whether by design or coincidence, they are altering the atmosphere in which tomorrow's negotiations will take place. From Moscow's perspective, NATO's actions are never viewed in isolation. They're read through the lens of timing, intent, and history. For decades, Russian military doctrine has warned about what it calls preemptive aggression. This is the belief that an adversary could disguise preparations for a real offensive behind the facade of defensive drills, routine troop rotations, or so-called training exercises. The 2014 edition of Russia's Military Doctrine, a public strategic guide, makes it explicit. Large-scale exercises near its borders, especially those involving long-range precision strike systems, will be treated as potential indicators of hostile intent. In practice, this means that what NATO sees as routine, the Kremlin is conditioned to interpret as a possible first step toward war. That's why the reaction from Moscow this week has been so sharp. In a statement reported by the BBC, the Russian Ministry of Defense accused NATO's current posture of demonstrating hostile intent and increasing the threat to the Russian Federation. This isn't just bluster for domestic audiences. Analysts at the Carnegie Moscow Center note that Russia's strategic culture is shaped by the trauma of past invasions, from Napoleon in 1812 to Hitler in 1941, when warning signs were ignored until enemy forces were already advancing. That history makes Russian planners far more likely to assume the worst about any military buildup close to their borders. Russian state media like RT and Izvestia have amplified that narrative, warning that the arrival of U.S. bombers in the UK and NATO's Arctic exercises could be part of what they call pre-strike conditioning. The language mirrors one of the Cold War's most dangerous moments, the 1983 Able Archer incident. Able Archer was a NATO command post exercise meant to simulate a shift from conventional warfare to nuclear release. It was purely defensive, but Soviet intelligence misread it as a possible real-world first strike. Declassified CIA files later revealed that the USSR placed its nuclear forces on heightened alert, bringing the world alarmingly close to disaster. The takeaway is not that NATO is preparing to attack Russia in 2025, it isn't, but that Russian threat perception is not based solely on what's true right now. It's built on decades of political and military conditioning that treat these scenarios as both possible and historically validated. And once that perception sets in, it shapes decisions at the very top. For Vladimir Putin, the political optics are as critical as the strategic realities. His core support base, especially inside the security services and military elite, expects him to project unwavering strength against Western pressure. He has built his public image around defending Russia's sovereignty from outside forces. Walking into the Alaska summit while NATO is visibly flexing on multiple fronts, from the Barents Sea to the Suwalki Gap, creates a domestic narrative in which any concession could be painted as weakness. That would damage his negotiating position abroad and his political standing at home. The danger is the feedback loop this creates. The more NATO signals readiness, the more Moscow feels encircled. The more Moscow feels encircled, the more it escalates to avoid looking vulnerable. And in that climate, even well-meant defensive moves can erode the space for real compromise. Diplomacy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Every handshake, every glance across a polished table is shaped by what's happening outside that room. The atmosphere, the perceptions, the backdrop, they can tilt the outcome as much as the proposals themselves. Former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz put it simply: the context is part of the content. If Vladimir Putin walks into Anchorage tomorrow believing NATO's recent moves are setting the stage for escalation, that belief will travel with him into every sentence and every pause. Leaders who think they're negotiating under military pressure don't soften their stance, they harden it. Instead of meeting in the middle, Putin could push his demands further, raise new red lines, or shut down talks on key issues entirely. European diplomats, speaking to Reuters, have warned that the scale and timing of NATO's activity give Moscow an easy narrative, that it's the one under threat, forced to negotiate from a corner. And in Russian domestic politics, that story plays perfectly. State TV can loop images of U.S. bombers in England, missile launchers in Germany, and NATO ships near the Barents Sea, all framed as proof that Russia is being encircled. Under those optics, any deal involving compromise becomes dangerous for Putin at home, an opening for hardliners to brand him weak. In Washington, the calculation is the mirror opposite. NATO's forward deployments show unity, capability, readiness. That can be leveraged, in theory, to negotiate from a position of strength. But leverage cuts both ways. Push it too far, and it stops looking like strength. It starts looking like provocation. At that point, it can close the very doors it's supposed to open. The real gamble is whether this pressure nudges Putin toward a deal to avoid escalation, or locks him into defiance to prove he won't be pushed. History gives more warnings than reassurances. In 1961, John F. Kennedy met Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna just after a surge in military posturing on both sides. The summit didn't cool tensions, it cemented them. Khrushchev walked away thinking Kennedy could be pressured further, a misreading that fed directly into the Berlin crisis and the building of the Berlin Wall. Or look at 2008, when NATO-Russia relations frayed in the months before the war in Georgia. Diplomatic channels were open, but mutual military signaling made any compromise politically toxic. When the fighting began, those channels collapsed almost instantly. The takeaway is simple. The signals you send before and during a summit are not background. They are part of the negotiation itself. In Anchorage, the first minutes could be shaped less by talking points and more by the mental images each leader brings into the room. For Putin, American bombers lifting off from Fairford and destroyers maneuvering in Arctic waters. For Trump, Russian armor dug in across eastern Ukraine and missile brigades in Kaliningrad. Those images will sit at the table too, silently influencing every offer, every refusal, and every calculation about what comes next. This is where the situation shifts from tense to dangerous. In periods of high military alert, the risk of a single misunderstanding spiraling out of control goes way up. Every movement, every radar signal, every maneuver is filtered through suspicion. In that kind of environment, even a tiny deviation from protocol can become the spark that sets off a chain reaction. Picture this. A NATO reconnaissance plane drifts a little too close to Russian airspace. A Russian interceptor responds faster and harder than usual. What starts as a routine intercept turns into a tense standoff in seconds. The Pentagon's own reports, including the 2023 Freedom of Navigation Summary, confirm that these incidents at sea and unsafe intercepts have been rising steadily for years. These encounters aren't just close flybys. They can involve radar lock-ons, when one aircraft's targeting system paints the other, or high-speed passes within a few dozen feet. In the heat of the moment, that doesn't feel like a warning. It feels like an attack getting ready to happen. History shows how thin this margin really is. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the headline example when a handful of tense days brought the world within hours of nuclear war. But other cases are just as revealing. In January 1995, Russian early warning radar detected what looked like the launch of a U.S. submarine-launched ballistic missile. In reality, it was a Norwegian scientific rocket studying the Northern Lights. For several minutes, Russia's nuclear command protocols were activated, and President Boris Yeltsin's nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, was opened for a possible launch order. Only after further tracking did they stand down. That was during a period of relative peace. Now imagine the same thing today, except with NATO bombers already in the air over Europe, Russian missile brigades on high alert, and naval forces from both sides operating in tight, contested waters in the Baltic and the Arctic. A small collision, a bad radar reading, or even a garbled radio message could be read as a deliberate strike. And when political leaders are already under maximum pressure, like Trump and Putin will be during the Alaska summit, the temptation to respond forcefully, to stand firm for domestic audiences, can outweigh the instinct to cool things down. Defense experts from the Royal United Services Institute and RAND agree on one thing. The only real safety net in moments like this is direct, reliable communication between militaries. NATO says its deconfliction lines with Russia are still open. But open lines are not the same as open trust. Calls can be ignored, messages delayed, and even when the other side picks up, there's doubt about whether they're speaking in good faith. That's a dangerous illusion, because in a crisis, thinking you have a safety net when you really don't can be the most dangerous thing of all. So, where does this leave tomorrow's summit? The truth is, neither side is going to walk into that room without calculating the military balance in the background. For the United States and NATO, the recent deployments send a message of resolve and readiness. For Russia, they confirm a narrative of encirclement and threat. Somewhere in between lies the reality. Both sides are trying to shape the other's behavior without crossing the line into open conflict. The question is whether that balancing act will hold over the next 24 hours, or whether the symbolism of strength will overshadow the possibility of compromise. If history teaches us anything, it is that diplomacy works best when both sides feel they have room to maneuver. As the world watches Anchorage tomorrow, remember that what happens in those private discussions will be influenced not just by the talking points, but by the jets on runways, the ships at sea, and the missiles and storage facilities thousands of miles away. The risk is not just that the summit fails, but that it fails in a way that makes escalation more likely. In the days ahead, we'll find out if the moves of the past few weeks were a masterstroke of strategic positioning, or a misstep that set the stage for more confrontation. If you've watched this far, you're not just skimming headlines. You're trying to understand the deeper currents shaping our security. So let me ask you, in a moment like this, is it better for America and its allies to show maximum strength, or to dial down the pressure in order to give diplomacy its best shot? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the debate over that question is as critical as anything the leaders will discuss tomorrow. And if you want to stay ahead of these developments, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because the next 72 hours could reshape the balance of power. And you'll want to know about it as it happens.